Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're doing our official tier list, our first tier list for this new metagame in Shining Revelry. I'm actually really excited to do this. All of the decks have been really substantial, and there's a ton of different decks that I think are really good, and I just think that this is going to be a great experience to gather all of our thoughts and just rank these decks right now early on in this format. So a couple of caveats before we get into it. First and foremost, this is definitely going to be my opinion. It's all based off of the results and the data over the last few days since this set was released, so keep that in mind, but this is still my opinion. Feel free to disagree down in the comment section below and let me know, where you think I went wrong on this tier list. But hopefully I give my justification as to why I put decks in what tier. The other thing that I wanted to mention as well is that I have like 32 or 35 different decks here on this tier list, so but I haven't included every single deck, right? I don't have all of the time in the world, and some decks that some people might be wondering about, just don't see enough competitive play, and we don't have enough data for me to really rank them. So stay tuned for future tier lists and the updated tier list that we'll do on this expansion and in this format. But for right now, these are all of the decks that I think are seeing play competitively in the format right now. And then again, this tier list won't be like in perfect order. It's just going to be me putting the decks in the tiers, and then the tiers themselves are probably not going to be in order, so just keep that in mind. And then lastly, the difference between something like an A tier and B tier is honestly pretty minimal, but they are different. I just don't want people to think like, oh, B tier's terrible. It's not. B tier's not terrible, and it's not that different than A tier. So anyway, guys, let's get right into it. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe and join the Discord. Link will be down in the description below. Okay, let's get right into this. So we're also going to be moving kind of quick because we have a lot of decks here. I don't want this video to be an hour long, so let's get right into it. So first and foremost, we are going to be taking a look at just straight Giratina. This is 18 Trainer Giratina, and I actually think that there's a lot of other ways that we should be playing Giratina. Personally, I think that Giratina is an incredible card, and it's made a massive impact on the metagame and a lot of different archetypes, but if we're playing Giratina, I think we benefit mostly by playing it with things like Darkrai or with Mewtwo, which we'll see later in this tier list. But 18 Trainer Giratina is good, but I don't think it's really that good. I think there's a lot of other decks that are probably better than 18 Trainer Giratina for a variety of different reasons. I think that, of course, you really only need one Giratina because you would rather set up maybe a stronger Pokemon in the meantime, or a Pokemon that provides more value while we're using Giratina's ability to set itself up. So having two Giratinas realistically isn't that big of a deal. Also, Giratina only does 130 damage. With red, that is 150. It's a pretty substantial number, but it's not that good of a number. Again, I think we would rather commit those energies manually to something like a Darkrai EX or a Mewtwo EX. This right now isn't the most popular way to play Giratina. In fact, it's probably one of the least popular ways to play Giratina, and it has probably the lowest win rate out of any of the Giratina decks. I'm actually going to put 18 Trainer Giratina right here in the C tier. We're looking at about a 43% win rate, which is actually really low. And like I said, there's a lot of really good decks in the format. 18 Trainer Giratina is just not a deck that I would choose to play really over most other decks right now in this new metagame, so it's going to go right here in the C tier. Now, next up is actually going to be the other 18 Trainer deck, which is Articuno. And Articuno 18 Trainer is not as good as I thought it was going to be when, the set hadn't released yet and we had seen, some of the new cards, things like Team Rocket Grunt and things like Red. Those were cards that I really thought would make Articuno 18 Trainer a lot better. And you know what? It actually did. Those cards did improve 18 Trainer Articuno. However, the thing is that it also made all of the other decks in the format better as well, and it kind of had the inverse effect on 18 Trainer Articuno. So I don't think that Articuno is bad. By no means necessary. I think that Articuno is still a very solid deck, especially in ranked battles. Whenever you have the opportunity to Blizzard on turn 1 and flip a bunch of heads with Misties early in the game, you're going to get your opponents conceding a lot. So I don't think that Articuno 18 Trainer is as good. I thought it would be like a top 5 deck of the format. I don't think Articuno is that high up on my tier list. It is still a respectable deck. It's just below 50%. It is the 8th most played deck of this format right now. And like I said, I just think that all of the other decks playing red and a lot of other decks, I should say, playing Team Rocket Grunt, it kind of made Articuno even worse than I honestly thought it was going to be. So Articuno 18 Trainer is going to go right here in the B tier. Again, the tiers are not in order, but I would say that 18 Trainer Articuno is probably really high B tier, whereas, 18 Trainer Giratina is really high C tier. So anyway, these are the 18 Trainer decks. I'm actually pretty glad that 18 Trainer hasn't completely taken over the format. Yeah, there we go. 18 Trainer Articuno. It's going to go into the B tier. Like I said, a lot of other decks are performing better than Articuno. in this format. So there we are. Next up is going to be some of these Arceus decks. Now what you'll see on the tier list is that we have a lot of grass type decks, like grass energy based decks. And the reason for that is that we actually have a ton of grass Pokemon that are pretty relevant, and they can all combine in different ways. And basically you can mix and match which grass type Pokemon you're playing with each other, and it actually changes the decks quite a bit. And I think that they're all different archetypes. So the first one that we're going to take a look at is actually going to be Arceus with Meowscarada. And this is a really interesting deck because to me, it seems like there would be some redundancy here. I was always saying early on that Arceus and Meowscarada were very similar cards. They both did 130 and had 140 HP. But the thing is that Meowscarada has actually emerged as a very significant Pokemon in the format. Even though I think Arceus is maybe less so viable than it was in previous formats, Meowscarada is still very, very good. And again, we can play maybe that Carnavine because we're playing Arceus, so there's a little bit of flexibility in this grass type deck. Arceus is still a decent attacker, but yeah, Giant Cape on Meowscarada does, again, put it at 160, which is out of range of most Pokemon being able to KO it with, of course, red, because red doesn't work for Meowscarada, right? It doesn't apply that extra damage because it's not an EX Pokemon. So having 160 HP with Giant Cape and then doing 150 with red is really substantial, and we can attack for only 2 energies, which is definitely a sweet spot for some of these stage 2 Pokemon. It allows us to attack on our 3rd turn if we are going first, and that is very substantial. So Arceus and Meowscarada is actually really good. It's the 20th most played deck of the format, so not a massive sample size, but it is floating at around a 53% win rate, and it has performed really well in various different online competitions, even in the first 5 days of play here. So Arceus and Meowscarada is actually really, really good. And I think what we're going to see here in this tier list is that a lot of these grass type decks are really good. They're probably going to fall everywhere in that A to B tier range. They're all really respectable. Arceus and Meowscarada is going to go up here into the A tier. I think most Meowscarada decks honestly do fall into the A tier. I think that they're really, really good. And they're even better against a lot of these Giratina decks because, like I said, Giratina can't even take the KO, but Meowscarada can take the KO on Giratina. Giratina does damage to itself when it attacks. So even with Giant Cape, things are definitely looking up for Meowscarada right now in the format, and I really do like it. It's definitely going into the A tier, and I don't think this will be the only Meowscarada deck to fall into the A tier as well. Next up is going to be Dialga and Arceus. This is the classic Dialga and Arceus build, so we're not playing Giratina. Maybe we are playing Red or some of the new cards like Iono or Pokemon Center Lady or Team Rocket Grunt. There's a bunch of different ways that we can build this list. I do think this is still a good deck, but I don't think it's nearly as good as it was in previous formats. I think a big reason for that is because a lot of Pokemon are able to KO Arceus and Dialga now with Red, and I think that Red really did nerf Arceus pretty significantly. Also, Dialga gets kind of beat by an early Team Rocket Grunt, so there's a lot of scenarios where I think that Arceus and Dialga is less good now than it was in the previous format. It's still a very respectable deck. It is currently still, it's going down in play, but it's still like the 2nd or 3rd most played deck of this format so far, but it's floating at around a 47% win rate. So like I said, not anything super substantial, and the sample size is actually fairly big already for this deck because a lot of people are playing it. So this is a deck here that I think is going to fall probably towards the bottom of B tier. It's borderline high C tier, low B tier to me. That win rate, and given its participation, its win rate still being that low, definitely tells me that it's struggling more in this format, much more than it was in the previous format. So yeah, it's going to go right there into the B tier. And again, one thing I am going to note here for this video is that we typically do like updated tier lists, and we make new tier lists as the format goes on because decks become better as time goes on. People include new cards in the deck, or, if other decks see more play or less play, some decks become more viable in the format. So this is a tier list based around like the metagame and which decks are best to play in the metagame. So something like, Arceus and Dialga could be better later on, or when the new set comes out, things like that. But for right now, this is sort of how I'm ranking these decks currently in the metagame in terms of decks that I would choose to play. Okay, so next up is going to be Beedrill and Meowscarada, another grass type deck. Again, tons of different combinations here on how we can play these grass type Pokemon together. And again, Meowscarada and Beedrill are both extremely, extremely good cards. They have really proven to be much better than I even anticipated them to be before Shining Revelry came out. I think Team Rocket Grunt, when paired with Beedrill, is really good. Again, Meowscarada gives it that potential to do a lot of damage. And again, we can possibly set up Meowscarada before we set up Beedrill. We can go into double Meowscarada and then finish the game with Beedrill. So there's a lot of Pokemon in this deck. It can flow a little bit inconsistently, but once this deck does get set up, or if it gets set up early enough, there's not a lot of decks that can really compete with it. It lacks some consistency, right? Of course, because all of the evolution Pokemon, but Still a tremendously strong card, both of these cards really, and I think they pair together really well. This is the 27th most played deck so far of the format, but it has a 55% win rate, amongst the highest out of really a lot of the decks so far in the format. And again, it's going to be rising in play. Beedrill, of course, has seen a lot of success both in ranked mode and in tournament so far, and there's a couple of different ways we can play Beedrill. In fact, we have 3 different Beedrill decks on the tier list, but this is going to go into the A tier as well. Again, a lot of these grass type decks and a lot of these Meowscarada decks are just that good. I don't know if they're really kind of vying for that like top 3 spot. I don't know if they're going to be, you know, anywhere close to the S tier at least right now this week, but they are comfortably in A tier, and that is definitely how I feel about these decks right now. So next up is going to be the old classic Exeggutor and Celebi, and actually for some reason I think that this deck is better in this format than it was in previous formats. I think a big reason for that is that Exeggutor is actually really good in the format right now. 160 HP with Giant Cape, with Erika's, with Potion. We're able to live basically attacks from everything in the format, and with Red, Exeggutor is able to take KOs maybe a little bit earlier than it was before, so Celebi now can actually act more consistently as that final attacking Pokemon, and the longer that Exeggutor survives in a passive format like we have right now, then the more energies go on Celebi and the more damage it can possibly do. So I actually think that Exeggutor and Celebi is fairly decent. It's about 50% win rate. It's going to go right here into the B tier. Again, these aren't in order, but yeah, Celebi and Exeggutor is actually better than it was last format, which is kind of a surprise to me. But again, when you have 120 HP, things like Giant Cape and Red don't really matter because Pokemon were KOing you anyway. But I think for Exeggutor, it made those cards made Exeggutor that much better. So yeah, I think Exeggutor is still really good. I think there's probably better Pokemon to pair with Exeggutor than Celebi, but this is definitely still a B tier deck, which again, I'm kind of surprised about, but pleasantly surprised about, because I'm sure a lot of people who don't have the new cards do probably have Celebi and Exeggutor. So this is definitely a deck that a lot of people can still build. And yeah, very respectable deck here. Gonna go into the B tier. Next up, we have Clodsire. Now, Clodsire is funny because it hasn't seen too much play early on. I think, unfortunately for Clodsire, it came out in a time where a lot of people are still playing Arceus. Of course, Arceus is immune to poison, but it also came out at the same time as Pokemon Center Lady, which is a healing card that a lot of decks are teching into their deck lists, and it also heals status conditions. So Clodsire is actually an extremely strong Pokemon. It's Dark type as well, which is really good. We're hitting a lot of the best Pokemon in the format for weakness, but unfortunately, like I said, it just came out at the wrong time. I think its matchup spreads are a little bit too non-versatile, like with so much Arceus and Pokemon Center Lady seeing so much play, as well as potions and stuff in a lot of these decks. I just don't really think that Clodsire is super well positioned, even though I think inherently it is a really good card. 2 energies on a stage 1 Pokemon being able to do 120 damage is absolutely crazy. It's also got a lot of HP, which again is really good. 160 is a great amount of HP in the format. So Clodsire really has everything going for it other than its position in the metagame, which is again a little bit disappointing, I'm not going to lie. Clodsire is, I think, actually going to go high C tier right now, although it does have a case to go low B tier. I just don't know if I would recommend playing Clodsire in the format right now. But again, if Arceus really falls off, or if maybe there's some way to really stick those status conditions more consistently, then I think Clodsire has a tremendous amount of potential as well. I think it's also weak to fighting. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, I think it's weak to fighting, which is really interesting because there are still actually a lot of fighting type cards in the format right now. So yeah, Clodsire isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's a good card, just not very well positioned in the format. It's got to go high C tier for me. Again, about a 47% win rate for this deck. So that's kind of all I really have to say about Clodsire. I love Clodsire. I wish it was better. Next up might be a surprise to some people. We have both Darkrai and Greninja and Darkrai and Magnezone. These are sort of the legacy, traditional ways that we played Darkrai. In fact, I'm actually going to move up, Darkrai Weavile. So now we're going to cover just all of the Darkrai decks all at once. And the thing with Darkrai and Greninja is that it's actually as good as any deck is in the format right now, in my opinion, at least Darkrai decks. I think that the format is really well positioned for a lot of Greninja decks. Again, the format is a little bit slower. It's a little bit passive. Decks are kind of setting up their Pokemon on the bench. They're not really doing much on the first 2, 3, sometimes 4 turns. So being able to evolve up Greninja while doing that chip damage with Darkrai is actually really substantial. Again, we're probably playing Druddigon in this list as well, which is still really good in the format. So the win rate for this list is actually incredible. This is the 18th most played deck so far of this format, but it has a 53.5% win rate, which again is amongst the highest out of, again, a lot of the decks in the format. This is a really well positioned deck. it's interesting to me because out of all of the stuff that's happened and all of the changes, it actually shifted in a way that I think Greninja decks are actually better than they ever have been. You can still play Gyarados in Greninja, but I think for the most part, Darkrai is probably the best partner for Greninja right now in Pokemon Pocket, and this is a very, very good deck. So again, if you wanted to play sort of an older deck list that is still good or is now better in this new format, I think this is a really good choice for you, and this is going into the A tier. I don't know exactly where it would fall into the A tier, we'll have to see. But definitely an A tier deck with that win rate. It's a deck that I haven't really played too much myself, but just looking at all of the data, it has performed really well, and I think it's really well positioned. I think that makes sense, honestly. Now, on the flip side of the coin is going to be Darkrai and Magnezone. And Magnezone is a card that really has struggled over the last few formats. Yes, we have Red, and yes, we're not an EX Pokemon, so Red isn't doing that extra damage to Magnezone, but 110 damage just really doesn't cut it. 130 with Red still isn't enough to KO basically most Pokemon with Giant Cape. And yes, we have that extra damage with Darkrai, but the thing is, there's a lot of potions in Pokemon Center Lady seeing play. So as opposed to something like Greninja, for whatever the reason, Magnezone just isn't nearly as good in this format right now. And for that reason, it's had a much lower win rate. It's seen basically the same amount of play as Darkrai in Greninja, but it has a 46% win rate as opposed to Greninja's 40 or 53%. So a massive difference in win rates here. Again, this was a deck that was at one point at the very top of the metagame, but things have changed very dramatically. So Darkrai and Magnezone is going to fall right here into the C tier. I think it's about middle to low C tier. Again, not a great time to be playing Magnezone in general, but if we are playing Magnezone, I think there's some other better ways to be playing it. So yeah, Darkrai and Magnezone is going to go right here into the C tier. And then next up we have Darkrai and Weavile. And Darkrai Weavile is one of sort of my top decks of this format. I think it's definitely a top 10 deck, potentially a top 5 deck of this format. I think being Dark type is very advantageous with all of the Psychic Pokemon, specifically Giratina, seeing play in this format, and being extremely aggressive in a format that is very passive and very much not aggressive does give this deck a distinct advantage. Giant Cape can bring both of these Pokemon to 160, that's a pretty good amount of HP, but with Red and Weavile in that fast-paced aggressive, being able to attack a turn earlier than most decks, we are able to get 2-hit KOs on basically everything in the format. Like I said, hitting for weakness against most things as well. We still have the Dawn combo. Now we also have Team Rocket Grunt, which I think people are playing in this list to further extend some of these decks into the late game, while we're, again, very aggressive in an early game deck. So a lot going for Weavile and Darkrai right now. I think this is definitely an A-tier deck. It's floating at around 53% win rate, and it is the 7th most played deck of this format right now. Very, very impressive showing early on for Weavile and Darkrai, and potentially, maybe not, but potentially the best way to play Darkrai right now. Now, the other Darkrai deck is going to be Giratina and Darkrai. Now, this is interesting because I did make a video day one when the set released saying that this was the new strongest deck. And at the time, I really did think it was, and I think it is still probably a top 3 or top 5 deck in the format. This is the #1 most played deck so far of the Shining Revelry metagame, and this deck has a 55% win rate. So I don't think I was wrong in saying that this is definitely one of the top decks of the format. In fact, I still believe that to be the case, but here is something that might surprise you guys. This deck here is going to fall right here into the A tier. I'm going to put it top of A tier, and that might be a surprise to you guys, and I'm sure that might make some of you guys a little bit, you know, angry or confused, but no, I don't think that many decks are in the S tier. Now, I could have made this tier list a lot of different ways. I could have put a lot of different decks in A tier or S tier, or I could put a lot of different decks in A tier, and I think I really want to make a distinction right now between S tier and A tier decks. So Giratina and Darkrai is going to be at the very tippy top of A tier, at least at the moment, but I don't feel as confident in saying that this is an S tier deck. I think it very well could be as time goes on, but as we'll see, there are a couple of decks that are on the rise that are actually really strong against Giratina and Darkrai, but realistically, I think that this deck has almost everything going for it. Giratina is able to set itself up with its ability while we manually attach to Darkrai. We're able to do chip damage while setting up 2 really strong attacking Pokemon. We're mixing Psychic and Dark, which is really strong because Darkrai can hit for weakness on all of those Giratina and other Psychic type Pokemon. Pokemon. The main thing with this deck right now is that Druddigon is somewhat of a liability sometimes. There's a lot of different Pokemon in the deck, and depending on which Pokemon we draw early game, that can be a downside. If we don't get that Giratina out early enough, the deck can struggle. And not only that, but a lot of different decks are playing healing cards right now, so that extra damage that Giratina or Darkrai does is sometimes just not enough to really, end up doing enough damage to take KOs. So it's got a lot going for it, but I do think that there are some hard counters developing for this deck. Again, the number one most played deck at 55% win rate is very, very impressive, but it is going to go right here at the top of A tier. I know that's going to surprise some of you guys. But next up is going to be Dialga with Giratina. So this is a difference between Dialga and just straight Arceus. Now we're tucking in Giratina. And this is an interesting one because I think a lot of people had this deck potentially as like one of the, top decks of the format. I think some people on YouTube covered this list early on saying that it was extremely strong. Again, I think that Dialga and Arceus are both less, viable in this new format for all of the reasons that we've already talked about. And when you throw Giratina in the deck, I do think it makes it better, but I don't think it makes it better enough to still compete with all of these other decks that we see in the A tier. And no, I don't believe this is by far definitely not the best way to be playing Giratina. So again, I don't know exactly how I feel about this list. It has a 46% win rate, so we have to be, again, just very careful about where we're placing these decks. So Dialga and Giratina is probably going to go either high C tier or low B tier. I think right now we're going to put it low B tier, but I think it's very close to the C tier. So again, keep that in mind. This is definitely not a top deck of the format, and I feel confident in saying that right now. Okay, so next up is going to be Exeggutor and Arceus. We're going to move a little bit quicker now. We're already 20 minutes in. I always say that, but we're going to move a bit quicker. Exeggutor and Arceus is, again, a little bit interesting. Again, I think Exeggutor is better in this new format, but there's a lot of other cards that I would rather run with Exeggutor than Arceus right now. Again, for all of the reasons we've already talked about, Arceus is less well-positioned in the format currently, and this, to me, is probably one of the less good grass type decks that is seeing play in the format right now. This is also probably going to go low B tier. I'm going to put it like right below Dialga and Giratina. Still a fine deck, but nothing close to A tier in my mind. Next is going to be Beedrill and Exeggutor. So again, another grass combo deck, but here's the thing. Exeggutor is still really good as a leadoff, and Beedrill is really, really strong. Still a lot of Pokemon on this deck, so it's going to lack a little bit of consistency. However, we're still playing Team Rocket Grunt. Beedrill, it can still do Beedrill things, and with Red, Exeggutor can extend a little bit farther. Both of these Pokemon have a ton of HP. We're playing Giant Capes, maybe, or Rocky Helmet, and we're playing Ericas. This is a really, really strong combination here. This is definitely an A-tier combo. Beedrill is just good. No matter how you look at it, no matter how I justify it, every single Beedrill deck has been performing well, and I think that Exeggutor is also the same way. So I think that they pair together really, really well. Now, the other Exeggutor deck is actually going to be with Meowscarada. So I just got to find it here because, again, I have notes on all of these deck lists, and I should have remembered this, but there's a lot of things to remember. So realistically, it's hard for me to do so. But yeah, so Exeggutor and Meowscarada, again, a really, really strong combination. So instead of like the Team Rocket Grunt Beedrill late game combo, now we just have Meowscarada, which again can do a lot of damage. And again, that 160 HP with Giant Cape means basically that it has 180 HP as if it was an EX Pokemon. Red does not work for Meowscarada. It's also a non-EX Pokemon and a single prize Pokemon, which again is really, really relevant. So I really like this combo as well. Yet again, another two grass type decks are cards that pair together really well. And this is actually the 10th most played deck of the format. This is the #1 most common grass type deck that's seeing play. And this deck has a 52% win rate. So again, just another impressive grass type deck that pairs really well together and has been performing really well day after day. And I think, honestly, it's going to go in the A tier again. I just don't have too much else to say. Like, there's so many different grass type combinations, and they all are really good for a variety of different reasons. We can really get into it why some grass type combos aren't as good as others, but realistically, I'm just going by the data and the feel in my playtesting for all of these cards individually, and I really think that most of these grass type decks are going to fall into the A tier. Some don't, but I think a lot of them really are high quality A-tier decks, which is really cool because I think the grass type cards are really good. I think we have like 4 or 5 grass type cards that are just really relevant, and they all pair together really interestingly. So Exeggutor Meowscarada going into the A tier for sure. Next up is fighting Magnezone. And fighting Magnezone is a very interesting one. I think that this deck definitely has a place in the format. Hitmonlee is really good with all of these Druddigon decks. It's also really good against Arceus as well. That gets set up on the back line if it's playing with Dialga. Also as well, like Gyarados is really popular, so Hitmonlee can auto-win against Gyarados. Again, I think that there's better partners for Hitmonlee than Magnezone, which again is probably why this deck hasn't seen as much play or hasn't had as much success as the other Hitmonlee decks, but I do think that it is still quality. I don't know if I really want to put this in the B tier. It really hasn't seen much play at all compared to basically all of the other decks on the tier list, and it doesn't have like a super crazy win rate. It's got about a 48% win rate, so I feel comfortably going like high C tier for fighting Magnezone. I think it's very respectable, and again, it's probably a good deck for those people that don't have all of the new cards yet, but you definitely can win games with this deck. Okay, now we get into Gallade. So this is just Gallade. I don't have, like on the image, I don't have it paired with any other card, but realistically, we're playing Gallade with Hitmonlee and Marshadow. Excuse me, and I think that Gallade is very good. I think it's very well positioned in the format for, again, a variety of different reasons. It's got a lot of HP with Giant Cape, that's 190, and a lot of Pokemon require like 3 or 4 energies to attack, so Gallade is able to do a lot of damage. Hitmonlee fixes that math, again, really improves your matchup against Gyarados. I think the other top way that we're playing Hitmonlee is with Rampardos, which we do see down here in the list here, so we will be ranking Rampardos decks later on, but no, I think Gallade is really good. So Gallade is actually the 3rd most played deck of this format. It's right behind Giratina and Darkrai and Dialga and Arceus. If that kind of says anything to you, this deck has a very consistent 52% win rate. Honestly, as far as decks go, I have this probably in my top 5, and if it's not top 5, it's probably, 6 or 7. It's right up there amongst the other top decks of the format. I think Hitmonlee is very well positioned, Gallade a very consistent card, and I think it really kind of stems back to the stage 2 Pokemon that have 2 energies in their attack cost. It makes them very, very consistent, especially with a strong leadoff Pokemon like Hitmonlee, right? Basically, on turn 3, we can still have 2 energies on Gallade while still committing that energy to Hitmonlee, fixing some of the math. I think the deck flows extremely well. You can still go Hitmonlee into Marshadow into Gallade pretty consistently. I just really like fighting in the format right now. I think I love Hitmonlee in the format, and I think Gallade is probably one of the best, if not the best partner for Hitmonlee, that fighting toolbox package in this current format. So Gallade comfortably going into the A tier, very confident about that. Again, the 3rd most played deck of the format with a 52% win rate. Very, very respectable. Shout out to Gallade. I think it's really kind of getting its flowers, which I think is cool because it is definitely one of the more unique, but also just really fun EX Pokemon in the game right now. Yeah, love Gallade going into the A tier. Next up is Dialga and Gholdengo. This might be confusing to some people as to why I'm playing or ranking this deck, and maybe not some other decks, but again, keep in mind, this is literally the 13th most played deck of this format so far, which is hilarious to me, but unfortunately, this is not a good deck. In fact, this is actually going to be our first D tier deck. This deck, being a top 13, like literally the 13th most played deck of this format, above a lot of other really good decks, has a 39% win rate. So I think out of all of the decks that we're ranking on this tier list, this is amongst probably the lowest in terms of win rates. This is just not a viable archetype right now. I think that Gholdengo is basically just a less consistent Celebi. Yes, it's a steel type Pokemon. Yes, it's not an EX Pokemon with 120 HP, so with Giant Cape, technically, we're living a few more things than we would be. That with Celebi, we can also play, I forget, I think it's Adamant, the supporter card, which again further reduces the damage that Gholdengo takes. But again, Team Rocket Grunt really does affect Dialga decks, and because it's a stage 1 Pokemon, it's just a little bit less consistent. And overall, I just really don't think this deck performs as well as it should, even in a passive format where you would think Gholdengo has a ton of opportunities to build up energies onto it. It just doesn't really end up being that great of a deck. Again, Sabrina still exists, and a lot of Pokemon in the format right now are still able to KO Gholdengo in one attack. So for all of those reasons, it's just not doing very well. Again, 39% win rate, very, very bad, amongst the lowest out of all of the decks on this tier list. So apologies to Gholdengo, but it just really isn't up there with all of these other decks. So I have to be realistic with how I'm ranking it. Now, the other thing that's surprising here is actually going to be Turbo Arceus, the traditional Turbo Arceus. So Arceus and Carnavine. Again, I don't think Arceus is very well positioned in the format, and if we are playing this grass type deck, I think we would want to play it with things like Meowscarada, which we saw up here was an A tier deck, but when you take out Meowscarada and you're not running that Pokemon, which is very, very good, this deck becomes a lot less relevant. I think it really does rely on that damage from Meowscarada. So Turbo Arceus without Meowscarada, still seeing some play. It's the 26th most played deck of the format, but it also has a 39% win rate. So unfortunately for Turbo Arceus, it's also going into the D tier. And again, if we are playing grass type Arceus, I really would recommend that we play it with either Exeggutor right here, or you're pairing it with Meowscarada, and it will make the deck much, much better. I definitely do believe that. Okay, so what do we got next? Next up, we have just straight Beedrill. We have 14 trainer Beedrill. This is just Beedrill EX with no other Pokemon, which is funnily actually pretty viable. It's not like a meme deck. It actually is pretty good. The cool thing about this deck is that technically people that are playing this particular archetype aren't playing Pokeball, which is one of the only decks in the format that doesn't play Pokeball. Again, our only basic Pokemon are Weedles, and Weedle's attack does search out your other Weedle. So we don't need Pokeball in this deck, and we're basically just going all in on the Team Rocket Grunt Beedrill combination. We have Erica's, we have Giant Cape, we have Got Potion, we have Red. We've got all of those great things that pair with Beedrill, but again, I think that if we are playing Beedrill, I think we would rather pair it with things like Meowscarada or Exeggutor. I think it just makes the deck a little bit more viable in more matchups. So this is a bit more of a high roller deck. It did place pretty well at the recent Ursa Days tournament, but I don't actually think it's as good as the other Beedrill variants like that are pairing it with Exeggutor or Meowscarada. I think the more Pokemon that you're playing, especially in the grass type decks, the more options that you have. And although this deck can feel really funny, it is a bit of a high roller strategy if we don't evolve that Beedrill early enough, and if we don't hit a couple Team Rocket Grunts early in the game, the deck just really doesn't function the way it needs to. This deck is going to go right here into the B tier. Again, not in order, but I think it's definitely sort of a mid to high B tier deck, about a 49.5% win rate, so fairly respectable, but not enough for me to put it into the A tier with the other Beedrill decks, and this is the 24th most played deck of the format. Beedrill itself is really good, so this is not a knock on Beedrill. In fact, it's actually the opposite, right? So a deck playing only Beedrill is actually in the B tier, and that's fairly impressive. It's right up there with Articuno. Again, not in order or anything like that, but yeah, shout out to Beedrill, a very, very good card in a variety of different archetypes. And even just only playing Beedrill is actually fairly good as well. Definitely fairly interesting. So next up is the last grass type deck, which is going to be Leafeon and Celebi. So the reason I put Leafeon and Celebi on this tier list is because it has actually the 15th most played deck of the format. So it is seeing a lot of play, or at least it did early on in the format. Again, I don't think that Leafeon is a good card right now, and I don't think that there's really much reason for us to be playing this particular grass type deck amongst really all of the other ones. This deck here, the 15th most played deck of the format, has a 39% win rate again, so it's going to fall right down here in the 39% win rate club. Again, I don't know exactly. I think some people just really like Leafeon and they wanted it to be good in this format. It's probably going to see a decline in play, but yeah, a 39% win rate, the 15th most played deck, seeing more play than a lot of these decks above it. For reasons I don't really understand. I would recommend not to play Leafeon above all of these other grass type cards that are just better, I think, especially in this format. So yeah, unfortunately, Leafeon just not that good. Again, 140 HP. It doesn't do a lot of damage. It only does 70 damage. Like even with red, you're just not taking any KOs. And if we're not taking any KO before we go into Celebi, we're just not able to win the game because Celebi will also be getting KO'd. So again, a lot of different reasons for that. 160 is a good amount of HP, but still quite a bit of Pokemon are able to KO you with red. So again, keep that in mind. Leafeon just not super good in this format, at least at the moment. Next up is going to be Lucario EX. So this is just the old Lucario strategy that I talked about a little bit early on. I thought this deck would be maybe a little bit better than it is right now. I don't think it's terrible. It's the 30th most played deck. It's got a 45% win rate. So again, not great. A little bit better than some of these decks here in the D tier. But no, I think there's a lot of other top tier fighting type decks that are just a lot better than Lucario EX. And if we are playing Fighting Coach Lucario, we probably want to pair it with things like Gallade or Rampardos to be a little bit more consistent. Lucario EX does 100 damage, which isn't that much for 3 energies. In a format right now, I think things are really reliant on being able to KO that active Pokemon. That's really what it comes down to. Lucario does do 30 damage to the bench, which is relevant, but for the most part, I think that, we would rather just KO that active Pokemon. So I think that's a big reason why Lucario EX maybe hasn't seen that much play. Also, for 3 energies, that attack cost is a bit steep. This is going to go probably low C tier. Not a terrible deck. Again, better than these decks in the D tier, but definitely could see some improvement. Not, the best deck to be playing in terms of the fighting type right now. Okay. So now we are going to, we're doing it, guys. This might surprise you guys, maybe it doesn't. I have been playing Giratina and Mewtwo almost exclusively for the last few days. I have talked about this deck a lot in my previous videos. This is a deck that actually won the 1,000 player Ursa Days tournament this past weekend. Not only that, but it has kind of carried me through Ultra Ball rank at a very high win rate. It was actually, you know what's really crazy about this list is that it didn't just win the Ursa Days tournament this weekend, but it was actually like a deck that only had like 10 or 15 people playing it, and it still ended up winning and also getting, I think, top 5 as well, the second highest ranking Giratina and Mewtwo deck. Giratina and Mewtwo is by far the highest win rate deck out of any of the top decks in the format right now. This deck is floating at around 58%. Again, I'm coming from the perspective of somebody that's played this deck a lot, and I think that because we're only playing 3 Pokemon in this list, it has a ton of flexibility. We can kind of cater all of those ancillary trainer cards to whatever matchups we're probably going to be going up against. Again, gives this deck a lot of flexibility. I think Mewtwo is extremely good in the format right now, having 170 HP, being able to attack for 170, allows us to KO basically everything in the format. We also have maybe 1 copy of Rocky Helmet with red to extend that to possibly 190, but also against something like a Gallade with Giant Cape, which has 190 HP, we're actually hitting for weakness, so that 170 for Mewtwo actually turns to 190. Very few things that this deck can't do. In my mind, I think this is actually the clear #1 deck in the format, and this is going to be the only S tier deck, at least this week for me, on the tier list. I think a lot of people were a bit confused as to why this deck is so good. I think at first glance, this deck would struggle against a lot of these Darkrai decks, and to be fair, it kind of does in some ways, but in other ways, it's actually a great counter to these Darkrai decks. So Mewtwo, again, 170 HP with Giant Cape. We're playing Potions sometimes, we're playing Pokemon Center Lady, a lot of healing in this list. Basically, it allows us to set up that Mewtwo on the bench and keep it at full HP, and then move in, take a KO, and then really nothing in any of these Darkrai decks can do 170 HP to KO us, even hitting for weakness, which allows Mewtwo to go turn after turn, take 2 KOs, and then the game is over. Or in some scenarios where Giratina can maybe KO that Druddigon in the active spot, and then Mewtwo can come in and then take a KO and whatever. This deck actually has a great matchup against Giratina and Darkrai, and again, it has a really good matchup against basically everything else in the format. I think the one thing this deck struggles with is probably Turbo Dark here with Weavile and Darkrai because of that fast-paced aggression, Team Rocket Grunts. There's a lot of reasons why Weavile and Darkrai is probably the only true counter to Giratina and Mewtwo. Also, Gyarados can be a little bit sketchy as well. That 180 HP is just out of range, but we do have Rocky Helmet to fix that math. To be fair, Rocky Helmet has won me a ton of games in this list, and like I said, 17 slots in the deck to play trainer cards, so we can kind of, pick and choose which of those trainer cards are best for us, given, the matchups or the common matchups in the metagame. This list is really incredible. By far, at least for me, early on in this first week of competitive play, this is by far the #1 deck of the format, and I really do believe that. If you don't believe me, go check out my live stream that I did a couple of days ago, where we absolutely dominated in Ultra Ball rank with this deck. It just feels so good. It's got everything going for it. In my mind, the #1 deck of the format. This is actually the 6th most played deck so far in the first 5 days of this format. I think that this will probably rise up to be a top 3 deck pretty quickly, and then we'll probably settle in as, still like a top 3 deck of the format. But for right now, early on, without so many people counterplaying it, I think that this is by far the #1 deck to play right now. And yeah, that's my S tier pick for this week. We're only going to have 1 deck in S tier because we are actually going to skip ahead and we're going to go to Gyarados, because Gyarados is the deck that I thought initially would have the best, chances to also make it into S tier. Here's the thing with Gyarados and why I think it honestly could be an S tier deck. It does have its consistency issues. Of course, there are scenarios where, you don't get Gyarados out early enough. You maybe get a hit with an early Sabrina. Whatever might happen, Gyarados goes down. Listen, I understand all of that completely, but Gyarados is probably the strongest single Pokemon in the entire game. 180 HP, out of range of getting killed by basically everything except for Charizard. And then and it does 140, but that's actually 160 because we have red now. We're playing Rocky Helmet as well in Gyarados most commonly. We're playing it mostly as an aggressive archetype. Again, I think a lot of people were asking, why don't we play like giant capes and stuff? I think that the extra damage modifiers really do help in a lot of scenarios. If Gyarados can't take one-hit KOs, then it really does struggle, and since it has so much high HP anyway, I think we would rather just play Rocky Helmet with red in the deck. Gyarados is extremely good. It is the 4th most played deck of the format, just behind Gallade, and it has a 54% win rate. So again, in a format where Hitmonlee is so popular, Gyarados is still sporting a 54% win rate, which is absolutely crazy because Hitmonlee is a direct counter to Gyarados. So there's a lot of reasons why I could justifiably put Gyarados into the S tier, but I think for right now, Gyarados is going to sit right here at the top of A tier, right next to Giratina and Darkrai, and I feel good about that. I think that there is still some separation between Mewtwo and Giratina, but Gyarados and Giratina and Darkrai are right there behind it. That's, again, just how I feel. Very, very strong. Very, very good. In fact, I'll put Gallade right up here as well. Just really, really good. I think that these 3 decks are kind of really vying. And I'll put Weavile Darkrai right here. I'll put these decks in order because I think there's like 4 or 5 decks that are right at the top of A tier, really contending for that top spot. I think A tier is absolutely stacked right now in the format. I think there's a lot of very viable decks, more so than maybe ever before. And I think it is actually really healthy for the metagame. So yeah, Gyarados, extremely good. Might be S tier. It could find its way into S tier, but as long as a lot of people are playing Gallade and Hitmonlee, I think Gyarados will maybe stay at bay. But again, 54% win rate is insane with how much Hitmonlee is seeing play. So yeah, just absolutely incredible. Next is going to be Palkia. Now there are a couple of ways that we play Palkia. I'm just including like this image. So just kind of like categorize this image of Palkia as like all of the Palkia decks, whether we're playing Washout Vaporeon or we're playing Origin Form Palkia or we're playing 18 Trainer Palkia. Just go ahead and for me bundle all of those archetypes into one Palkia deck. I think Palkia is really interesting. So the sample size for Palkia is a bit smaller. People are choosing to play things like Gyarados, like Articuno, a little bit more so than Palkia in this format. I still think Palkia is definitely a good deck. I don't know if I want to put Palkia into the A tier. In my mind, I think it's a really high B tier deck, right up there with Articuno. I think it's really good. I think it could find its way into a low A tier spot right now. But I just think that Gyarados is just a little bit more impressive, and even 18 Trainer Articuno I think flows a bit better than Palkia in a lot of scenarios. Again, if you're a Palkia lover and if you really love playing Palkia, I think it's still a totally fine deck. Again, all of these decks here in B tier are very respectable. I've kind of made a bit of a separation between A tier and B tier here, but I think as long as you're playing anything in B tier, you have a really good chance of winning a lot of games. So again, I said it early on in this tier list, don't spend too much time being angry that some decks are in B tier and not A tier. It really isn't that big of a difference, but yeah, I would put Palkia high B tier, just like Articuno. I think that they're kind of borderline BA, but I think comfortably they're going to go into the B tier. That's my mind. Okay, so now we have Pikachu EX, and the new Pikachu is actually pretty good. However, I just don't think we have enough cards to pair with Pikachu. Unfortunately, as far as single prize Pokemon go, we don't have a lot of options. And again, if we're playing Pikachu EX, we probably want to play the new Pachirisu, which means we would like to have a second Pokemon buffer, right? Similar to Origin Form Palkia, a Pokemon that we can kind of pair with Pikachu EX and Pachirisu to be sort of that second attacker to really allow us to finish games with Pikachu. We just don't really have that right now. So I think the main reason that people are, or the main way that people are playing the new Pikachu EX is just with Magnezone and Magneton and Dawn, which is still a totally fine archetype. But again, I don't think we've reached the maximum potential for something like Pikachu EX. And I think it is a really good card. It just doesn't have all of the tools that it needs right now. It is floating at around 45% win rate. Again, very small sample size. Not a lot of people bringing Pikachu in competitive play. It's going to go high C tier, right next to sort of Magnezone and Hitmonlee. I think it's a totally fine deck, but I just don't think it's nearly as good as a lot of these decks that we have above it on the tier list. And now we're going to get into Rampardos, because this is a very interesting topic or I guess discussion point here. I think Rampardos is a very, very good card in the format, but again, I think traditionally people play Rampardos, at least last format, people were playing Rampardos with things like Sudowoodo and Lucario, and I think that that's a totally fine way to play Rampardos, but again, a lot of these fighting type decks, I think, really do benefit from playing Hitmonlee. So Rampardos and Lucario is the 5th most played deck of the format, however, it has a 49% win rate. So Rampardos and Lucario to me is a B tier deck. I think it's still totally fine, but if we are playing Rampardos, I think we would much rather be playing it with Hitmonlee as a leadoff option. I don't think we actually need I don't think we need Lucario right now in the format for if we're playing things like Rampardos, because Hitmonlee is able to do a lot of that bench damage. It pairs really well with Cyrus, but we also have Red in the format, so Rampardos can just hit for 150, and I think that's just really relevant. I don't think Fighting Coach Lucario is as needed in some of these fighting decks as it was previously, again, because Red exists. So Rampardos and Lucario is going to go into the B tier. However, the other Rampardos deck, which is the 17th most played deck of the format, so a smaller sample size, but a much higher win rate at 56%. Again, small sample size, but 56%, amongst the highest out of all of the decks in the format. I think Rampardos with Hitmonlee is definitely an A tier deck. In fact, I'm going to put it right behind, actually, I'll just put it next to Gallade. Again, it's seen a lot less play, so it's a little bit less proven than Gallade and Hitmonlee, but I do think that these fighting decks with the Hitmonlee Marshadow combo with Red now are very, very dangerous against Cyrus, very consistent in these Hitmonlee decks. And again, Gyarados very popular in the format, Druddigon very popular in the format. I think Hitmonlee is as good now as it ever has been. And again, I think Rampardos is better with Hitmonlee than without it. So that's why Rampardos, Lucario going into the B tier, but Rampardos and Hitmonlee going into the A tier, and I really do feel confident about that. I think this will probably take over the other Rampardos variant as probably the most played version of it. At least it should, because I think it is much, much better. Again, probably a top 10 deck by far. I think a top 10 deck in the format right there, right close to Gallade as well. I think more people will just play Gallade because Gallade is maybe a little bit more fun, but you know, Rampardos does have the advantage of being a fossil Pokemon, which further increases our odds of leading off with Hitmonlee, which is what we want when we're playing these Hitmonlee Fighting Toolbox decks. So yeah, shout out to Rampardos, an A tier deck still, but again, we want to play it with Hitmonlee. That's my opinion. Okay, so next up, we've got some interesting ones. These are kind of all like off decks, but this is going to be Magnezone and Skarmory. So a deck that actually saw a bit of play last format for a variety of different reasons. I think that Hitmonlee, or not Hitmonlee, sorry. I think Magnezone Skarmory is, again, just a fine deck, but I just don't think it really has as much going for it as a lot of the other decks in the format. So it is about the 35th most played deck, so not a lot of people playing it. Small sample size right now, flooding around 48%. Again, Magnezone does struggle in a lot of different ways right now. I just don't really love Magnezone in this format. Skarmory can still be good. There's actually a lot of Pokemon that Skarmory can KO on turn 1, going second. And I think that's really valuable. I think that really does kind of carry the deck in some ways. I think that Magnezone and Skarmory is also high C tier. I think that it has a lot going for it, similarly to Magnezone and Hitmonlee, but again, I just don't love Magnezone, I think, in this format right now. I think there's just other better cards to pair with it, and hopefully we get other better cards to pair with Skarmory, which in fact, actually, we'll talk about right now, because next we're going to talk about Tinkaton. And Tinkaton is a card that really hasn't seen a lot of competitive play. I think that Tinkaton is actually totally fine. Again, it's a bit of an RNG card. Sometimes you do 80 damage, sometimes you do 160 damage, which is crazy. That's enough to KO, again, most Pokemon in the format. I think that Tinkaton is really good. I don't know how much better it is, truthfully, than like Skarmory and Magnezone. I think they're both similar. Not many people playing Tinkaton, to be fair. It hasn't seen a whole lot of play, so it's a bit hard for me to rank this deck, but it is also going to go into the C tier. I think that it's still good. I think it's still totally fine. We'll put it high C tier. Again, these aren't really in order, but yeah, I don't think it's really a B tier deck, but it is actually an archetype that exists and can win games. So I don't know if a lot of people are interested in playing Tinkaton, but if you really are interested, I think pairing it with Skarmory is actually fairly good. It's actually, I think, a totally fine archetype. You can go Skarmory into Skarmory and have enough damage on that active Pokemon to KO it with Tinkaton, even if it does do 80 damage, which allows you to then possibly high roll next turn and do 160 and just win the game with Tinkaton. I think that's really what it comes down to. But yeah, I think Tinkaton is fairly respectable, if I'm being honest with you, but I don't think it's necessarily that good. And now we have Snorlax and Meowscarada. So again, just another way that we're playing, you know, these grass type decks, and another way that we're playing Meowscarada. This is funny. Now, I think that there's probably better ways to play Meowscarada, if I'm being entirely honest with you, but again, a totally respectable deck here that is actually a viable archetype. Is it as good as a lot of these other grass type decks? No, I think I would rather play Meowscarada with Arceus or with Beedrill or with Exeggutor, but Meowscarada is such a good card. You know, Snorlax Berry is kind of a high roll deck. You can early, you know, attack with Snorlax back to back. It's pretty funny, and again, I think it's a somewhat viable viable deck, but I don't think it's as good. And we're going to go ahead and just put it in the C tier. Again, hasn't seen a lot of play, about a 48% win rate, which is pretty respectable, but a very, very small sample size for this list. And it did actually place high in various different online tournaments already, which is pretty cool. Okay, so let's wrap things up pretty quickly. Lastly is going to be Wugtrio. I have this here with Manaphy. You could just play 16 trainer Wugtrio. You could play it with Palkia. There's a lot of actually different ways people are playing Wugtrio. I'll be honest with you. Again, similar to Palkia, we're going to bundle all of the Wugtrio archetypes into one list, like just one image here on the tier list. So this is, this image is going to count for all Wugtrio decks. And I think Wugtrio is totally good. I think it's totally fine. I don't think it's like a super substantial deck. Again, probably a deck that's going to fall right here into the C tier. Again, these aren't in order. It could be high, it could be low. C tier. I don't really think, I don't feel as comfortable putting Wugtrio in the B tier. Like, that's kind of the reason why all of these decks are in the C tier, is I think that they're totally fine. They're respectable. They can win games, but they just haven't been as proven or as successful as the other decks in the B tier. I think there is a pretty stark difference between B tier and C tier, but Wugtrio is good. And this is a deck that could very well find its way up into B tier at some point. Again, not a lot of people are playing Wugtrio. I think it's a totally fine card. I think it's very similar to Dragonite, but just better in a lot of different ways. I like Wugtrio. Again, also a bit of an RNG card, which I think is the only thing really holding it back. Shout out to Wugtrio. It did make the tier list, and it is a deck which is going to fall here into the C tier. Let's just put it like randomly right here in the C tier. So again, shout out to Wugtrio. It's a really fun deck. I just don't feel confident enough putting it in the B tier. Now, that being said, we have Charizard, and Charizard is Charizard. This is still the 9th most played deck of the format. In fact, we're seeing an average win rate of 49%, which for Charizard is actually quite high. I think that Charizard is better now with Iono in a variety of different reasons. We still have 180 HP, so we're able to live attacks basically from everything in the format. Charizard's strong. It always has been. It's a very interesting deck because sometimes it just wins, sometimes it just loses, and it very much is sort of an RNG-based deck. Not only do we have to evolve up into Charizard, but we have to flip those heads with Moltres. So again, I think in a passive format and with Iono making this deck a bit more consistent, I think Charizard has more of an opportunity to be really valuable. It also kind of auto-wins against some of these grass-type decks, which is, again, pretty important if you keep that in mind. I think Charizard is very much B-tier. I think it's totally fine, like a high mid-B-tier deck. It could find its way into A tier. Again, if enough people play it and it places high enough in enough tournaments, and it kind of floats, if it stays around 50%, then you know what? Charizard might just be sort of a middle to low A tier deck. But I think for right now, we're going to go ahead and just put it in the B tier. I feel pretty good about that. Again, none of these are in order in their tiers, but that's going to wrap up this tier list, guys. Let me zoom out so we can just see everything all at once. There we go. Can you guys see that? Maybe not. There's the tier list. So yeah, again, I think A tier is very much stacked. I think there's a ton of decks that are vying for really that top spot, but at least in the first week or so, I think one deck has really cemented itself, and that is going to be Mewtwo and Giratina. I really suggest that you play this deck and learn how to play it, because it will win you games. It is extremely strong. I think far and away, probably the #1 deck so far. However, these 3 decks here right behind it, these 5 decks behind it have really emerged as also contenders for that S tier spot. Gyarados, Darkrai Giratina, Gallade, Rampardos, and Turbo Dark are all extremely strong decks that have the potential to possibly find their way into S tier right now. But yeah, the whole A tier, very stacked, and all of the cards in B tier, all of these decks in B tier, extremely good as well. And that's the thing to keep in mind, right? I mean, this deck here in S tier could lose to a B tier deck just like that, right? It just happens, but when we look at the data and we look at the sample sizes, that's how we sort of determine these tier lists and the placements of this tier list. So pretty long video. I apologize. We covered a lot in this video, but this was the first tier list of the new format, and I know some of you guys really do enjoy this format, so yeah, a bit longer than I wanted it to be, but anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. There's my tier list. Tune in next week. We're going to do another one a bit quicker, and we're going to update this based off of the next 7 days of competitive play, so stay tuned. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. We post videos about Pokemon Pocket basically every day on the channel, and a lot of things are changing, and things are just very interesting and really fun in Pokemon Pocket right now. So again, guys, comment below what you agree with, what you disagree with. Keep it civil, please. I really would appreciate that in the comment section. But again, thank you guys so much for watching. Let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.